Thank you all. Thank you, Alex and Mary, and everybody from REA that's helped us come together again. My name is Josh Lundy Whitler. I am the chair of the steering committee over at ALLLM, the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry. It's a tongue twister, so I still get still get it mixed up sometimes. But we are a organization that's been working with lifelong learners and lifelong those who are leading programs that are helping develop lifelong learning programs in ministry, and have been doing so for a better part of 50, 60 years now. So history, a lot of history in the organization, as well as with REA, of course. And we are, I guess it's been about 3 or 4 years now where we've established something known as a related learning organization of the REA. So we've had this working relationship with REA for the last few years, and we've had a relationship even prior to that. So many of our members are in both organizations. There's a joint membership option when you're applying to register for REA. So there are many ties between our organizations, but this is the focus on lifelong learning, and the part of this collaborative process that we began, and really last year doing it the conference virtually. One of the things that we wanted to do was explore more deeply this relationship between broader conversations in theological education, and specifically thinking about what it means to be lifelong learners as that becomes more important to the broader spectrum of theological education, with the new standards posted in the Association for Theological Schools, talking more openly about the need for us to be working more closely together. This collaboration makes a lot of sense as far as us having this conversation. We had a wonderful conversation last year, talking about some kind of giving a broad overview of some of the issues that we're exploring together, and maybe some of the issues that we see in theological education as a whole that may need addressing, may need updating as our communities of faith and also our institutions are beginning to change. And this year we wanted to do something a little more on the practical side of things, and also look at specific practices that we can engage in, and also kind of use that as an opportunity to kind of have a broader conversation about what's happening in our respective fields. And so I'll explain more in a second, and I think a lot of it will come clear as we go. But I want to I kind of introduced myself already as the chair of the ALLLM committee. I'm actually, Sarah Erickson, who's here with us, was the lifelong president of ALLLM, and I just recently assumed her throne. So it's been in this position for about 6, 7 months now at this point. So. And I'm also on the board for REA this year as the chair of the Harper Warren Committee. So, and I've been a part of REA for about 10 years now or so. And I'd love to introduce Dory to all of you. Many of you know Dory. She's been a part of REA for many years as well. And many of you know some of her books and some of her writings. You know her as a consultant. We incorrectly posted her as somebody who is working for FTE. I think you are correct me if I'm wrong, you still do consulting with FTE, correct? But
Correct.
yeah, okay. So, but at any rate, you're a group facilitator and have written a number of books. Will be some of the work that we're doing today, including the process for theological reflection that you've helped develop through those writings. We'll be doing some of that today in this session, and you have a new revised copy of Doing Girlfriend Theology, which came out, I guess, in 2005, the first edition. Is that right?
That's right.
Oh my goodness!
Sounds
And
right.
so
I
yeah,
get confused.
it's amazing. And so you have a new copy coming out in 2023, and again, many of the things that we'll be talking about today are coming out of much of her research and work with groups. And so I want to turn it over to Dory, but I also want to encourage everybody to see this session as a collaborative process. I think both Dory and I were wanted to be very intentional about this not being a monologue or even a dialogue between two people, but really a broader conversation. So we will be doing some small group work. And I also, I think we both want to encourage you all to share in the large group as well. This is a collective wisdom sharing and experience sharing exercise, and I think out of that will come our broader conversations about where the field is and how we can continue to collaborate together. So, and I apologize for having two different things up and my disembodied voice being what you're hearing and my face being somewhere else. But so if that's a little confusing, I apologize. But it's for the audio quality. So, without further ado, I'll turn that over to Dory. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate you and the fun we've had planning this session together in between our various bouts of COVID over the last few weeks. And I am so glad to see a lot of friends here and a lot of new faces as well. But welcome all of you to this Zoom space, to this Zoom room, to this happy gathering where we get to be together. We're going to lead you through some practices, and then we're going to reflect on those practices, and it'll be very interactive, as Josh said. The kind of flow of the time will be the care practices that I've written about with my colleagues, Stephen Lewis and Matthew Wesley Williams at the Forum for Theological Exploration. Those practices just kind of create a design that will begin with creating hospitable space for us to be in this room together, asking self-awakening questions, which allow us to go a little more deeply in a triad into a question that hopefully has resonance for all of us, reflecting theologically on what's the meaning that's surfacing for us as we think about the theme of this upcoming session, this upcoming meeting. What does it mean to be good ancestors as religious educators and as leaders in lifelong ministry, as people who steward practices that have been around for way long time, but that are constantly evolving, and how can we bring them to the world that needs them right now more readily? That's going to be our focus, and we'll end with reflecting on how we take this back to the places where we live and work. But we're going to begin with centering. So I'm going to ask Josh to just advance the slides to the one that has the invocation on it. Another advance, another advance, another advance. Here we go. We're going to prepare to wonder together by allowing ourselves, if it's possible and if it feels comfortable for you, to have both feet on the floor or the ground or the carpet or the rug or the tile or the wood, whatever is underneath you, supporting you. If you can get your gecko toes down on the ground while you enjoy a few deep breaths. I don't know where you're running from to be here, or maybe you're eating lunch, maybe you're squeezing this in between a few other things that need to happen today, but this is not the slide we want to be looking at. This is how the sausage gets made. Josh, can you give us the slide? There we go. That's where I want you to be. In a minute, we're going to ask you to turn your screen to gallery so you can see at least the names of everyone who's here. And while you're looking at those names, I'm going to ask you to unmute with me and just together, not in any kind of unison way. It's going to be much more like Pentecost Sunday for those of us from the Christian tradition. But I'm going to ask you to just repeat these words at whatever pace feels right to you. We'll put them in the chat because you won't be looking at the screen. But we're going to center by just looking at one another and remembering to be present with this invocation. I am alive. I am alive here now. I am alive here now with all of you. And as we repeat that phrase a few times, maybe you'll find a part of it that really speaks to you. Maybe there will be one word you're really grateful for today. Maybe it'll just be the fact that you are alive. Or maybe it'll be the fact that we are with you all. But just allow this to wash over you. And there's one more thing I'm going to ask you to do before you do that. And that is to think of a person, an ancestor of your actual lineage, of your DNA, an ancestor of your spiritual lineage, or an ancestor of your practical lineage, someone who's been part of your unfolding as a human being and a human being and doing what you do in the world. And just conjure that person's presence. Maybe you can see their face. Maybe it's an actual, a grandmother or a grandfather or great grandmother whose face you have or are lucky enough to have a picture of. But maybe you just place your hand on your heart and remember the feeling that you have when you think about this ancestor or elder who has been part of your unfolding. Because what I'd like to invite us to do is bring them into this time of centering as we look at one another and acknowledge who's in the space with us. So I'm going to turn myself to gallery view so I can see all of you. And going to ask Josh, if you could stop screen sharing for a moment, that might help us all see one another's faces. And then I'm just going to ask you to unmute. So we'll have everybody's voices entering in. And I'm going to put the words to this invocation in the chat box. I am alive here now with all of you. So let's begin. I am alive.
Alive.
Here, I'm alive
I am alive
now.
I am alive
I'm
here
alive
now.
here now.
I am alive here now with you all.
I'm alive
I'm alive here now.
I am alive here now with you all.
Alive here now.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate that we are alive here now in this moment together. And that is no small thing to take for granted. So we'll continue holding that knowledge with us as we move through this session together. So we are going to, as I said, explore a few different practices that welcome our wise and loving ancestors into the space. And Josh, if you'll take us back to your screen share and advance the slide. I'll tell you where this is coming from for me. Some of you might have read the essay that I wrote for the current edition of Religious Education. Patrick, when he announced this lovely, generous theme, asked me to reflect on a journey that's been mine over the last couple of years, beginning to think about who my ancestors are and how my wise and loving ancestors might want to participate in the work of healing the injustices that I see around me. And that work's been guided by a teacher. I'm going to hold up the book. Oh gosh, because it's fuzzy. I have to put it right where my face is. I'll put it in the chat in a minute. Ancestral Medicine by Daniel Four, PhD, who is he calls himself a recovering psychoanalyst, and he is trained in practices of ancestor healing from around the world. And I've been drawn to him and began reading his work in 2018 and learning, as I reflect in the essay, that I don't have to just feel guilty about what my ancestors did in the past. And I don't just have to feel jealous of my friends who are of traditions that have practices that call forth their ancestors. I can be proactive in wondering and then in inviting relationship with my wise and loving ancestors. And it's been, I'm going to ask you to go one slide more, Josh, please. There we go. Inviting my ancestors into the work that I'm trying to do, the work of healing the world. So I invite all of you to imagine that with me. And in the most recent weeks, I've been finishing the very last revisions of the new edition of Girlfriend Theology that will come out Women's History Month of next year. And as I've been doing that, this person and her work has become a very important conversation partner. So Dean Blevins led a REA theme, golly, how many years was that ago, around neuroscience and its import for religious education. And I'm finally catching up with you, Dean. Finally, it has become so clear to me, one of the reasons that we as religious practitioners steward spiritual practices, it's not just to build the church, it's not just to build the institution, it's not just to be part of sharing the gospel. It actually has an effect on people's lives. And Lisa Miller's book is about the benefit of spiritual practices for mental health. And it became important to me, as many of you are aware, we are living in a mental health epidemic, especially for young adults. And as my focus, throughout my career has been on young adults, I've become so aware recently that we have gifts that we're stewarding as religious practitioners, as pastoral leaders, that could be more generously let loose in the world so that they can be of help to people in their mental health struggles. And Lisa's work shows with fMRIs that spiritual practices actually have benefit to her work is with young adults in decreasing or providing a protective factor for the duration of depression, the severity of depression, and the outcome of depression. And the outcome, when she talks about the outcome of depression, I interpret that meaning the outcome not being suicide. And when I think of it that way, and I think about suicide as the second leading cause of death for young adults today, the first is fentanyl overdose, the second is suicide, the third is car accidents. And all three of those are not natural causes, right? Young adults don't die of natural causes. Young adults die of cultural causes and of causes related to addiction. And Lisa Miller is stating that many of the ways that young adults' mental health gets pathologized could be seen as what if we met these spiritual hungers in adolescence and young adulthood with all that we have, because in her words, much of what gets pathologized with mental health is developmentally appropriate spiritual hunger and spiritual questions. And so I read that as I'm tidying up the last of Girlfriend Theology. I had to completely rewrite the introduction, because the way I think of Girlfriend Theology always has been is as one intervention that can support a young person coming into adulthood in resources that can help them thrive and help them flourish. And I'm doing the work to make it, to address the gender binary. So it won't be girlfriend theology, it'll be girl/friend theology, because this is not just a problem addressing girls or boys, but also our non-gendered siblings and children and young adult children. So that's a little bit about where this is coming from for me. And as Josh and I talked about it, we thought, well, let's just engage in some spiritual practices and then ask the question of ourselves, how might we make these more available, not just more available within church and church-related culture, but in the wider circles that are adjacent to our campus ministries. And I'm thinking about, how do we make these available to our fraternities and sorority life? How are we making them more available to the places, sexual assault response teams, all of the places that young adults end up as they navigate young adulthood, who may not, as we well know from the Pew Research, be touching base with our religious community. So how do we shift? And Josh and I have been talking a lot about how that's a shift that has been wanting to happen among young adults called to pastoral leadership for over 20 years. And perhaps this pandemic and our responses to it has hastened the day that spiritual practices become more available. One more thing I'll say about that, just if I'm still a little bit abstract here, I've been so taken with the way mindfulness has become a practice, even in science classes in higher education, like the last holdout of where you would expect a spiritual practice to with ease be introduced. And mindfulness practices from Eastern traditions have now, they just made that move. And what I'm wondering is, how are some of the practices from my tradition, from Christianity, ripe for making that move in a way that has no need for dogma or belief attached? Think of the examen. What would it look like to have St. Ignatian's examen available in more spaces where we, at the end of the day, think about where did we come alive? That's one that just commutes across cultures without too many strings attached. And that's kind of what I'm wanting us to wonder today. What do we practice? What do we steward already that the world really needs for a time such as now? Not in the mental health crisis, but in the years before that, as a young adult is building up their resilience to the things that are going to happen in life. All right, that's my setup. And let's move along with what's next, Josh? Okay, I know. Well, in the chat box, yes. In the chat box, I just want to ask you to think about the young people you know, 13 to 30. And in the chat box, can you name an urgency that you are carrying for them, an urgency that you carry in your work around the young people who will be the ancestors after us, the young people for whom we're wanting to be better ancestors? What is a sense of urgency? And for example, in my life, I'm the mother of two young adults, and many of my friends are parents of young adults, and within my circle of friends, I know very few people whose young adults are not grappling with mental health crisis, mental health emergency, or mental health navigating anxiety and depression at some level or another. So if you'll just share in the chat what urgency you're carrying that spiritual practices might be useful in addressing. And Erica has named climate futures, and we're seeing the word climate despair in the literature. Yes, thank you. Gun violence. Thank you, Kathy. Trauma based on social, political. Yep, finding a meaningful life. Isolation. Yes, healing from adverse childhood experiences. Someone lifted joyfulness. I'm so grateful for that. And I'll just mention before we move on that Angela Gorel, who's the author of The Joy. Someone help me, I don't have it in front of me. We had a slide and it's gone. Pardon me?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember.
Okay, Angela Gorel's work. It's a slide down from here. Angela Gorel, who was part of the Yale Joy Project, has written a beautiful book about how we can address joy even in the midst of life suffering. And okay, yeah, thank y'all for putting these urgencies, multiple pressures to succeed. Yes, yes. Cultivating public spaces, places for nonviolent communication and dialogue. Yes. So these urgencies are what we bring to this question of how might our spiritual practices be made more accessible for the world that really needs them right now. And we're going to move into conversation around that in triads of holy listening. Some of y'all have probably been with me before when I've led holy listening. So in a minute, you're going to get into a Zoom room and there's going to be 3 of you. I'm going to ask you to quickly introduce yourselves to each other. Even if you already know each other, just quickly, briefly introduce yourselves. And you're going to have a question, a prompt. The next slide is going to give you a prompt. But first of all, I'm just going to give you the directions for what to do when you show up. When you show up in that room, you're each going to have 2 minutes to be the speaker, to tell a story. And when you're the speaker, I invite you to speak with your whole heart as fully as you can in this place that's not really safe at all, but we're hoping that it's safe enough. In answer to the question, why don't we go ahead and put the question up, Josh, the next slide. tell a story about something you found yourself doing during the past 2 years to help ground, center, or sustain yourself. So, Sarah, if you're the speaker, you're going to speak from the heart. I'm going to give you a minute to come up with your story. You'll have a full minute to think about this before you go into the room. But Sarah, if you're the storyteller first, you're going to talk for 2 minutes and you're just going to talk. You don't worry about it being pretty. It doesn't have to have a beginning, middle, and an end. It doesn't have to be clever. It doesn't have to be anything. It's just a story about something you did to ground, center, or sustain yourself during the last 2 years. And Mary, if you're in a group with Sarah, and Jack, you're in a group with Sarah, during the time that Sarah's speaking, you are going to focus on what she is saying as fully as you possibly can. When I lead this in secular spaces, I call it holy listening, WHOLLY. So you're listening with your whole self to this beautiful person who is alive with you now, telling a story. And that's your whole job, not to think about what you're doing next, not to think about your own story, but to focus fully on what is emerging, with the possibility that something will be said that surprises even the speaker, or with the possibility that in this brief encounter across all these different electronic pathways in our minds and in our worlds, the holy might show up. A sense of the sacred might show up in our connection with one another. So we're gonna do that. And if someone ends up in a room with 4 people, come back to the main room, because it would be better to be in a room with 2 people than a room with 4 people. So we're gonna try for rooms of 3, but if the numbers don't work out quite right, come back and one of us will go with you. Sound good? Everybody got it? We'll put the question in the chat box because the slide will disappear.
Dory, are we going to read your story first?
Oh, did I go too fast?
Well, I think that was the idea was we would read your story first, and then as kind of
absolutely.
Yeah,
Josh is going to share a little more from my essay about my journey with my ancestors, and then we'll go into holy listening. Thanks, Josh.
So we'll continue to hear Dory's story here, and this is an opportunity here also to begin that process of holy listening as we begin listening to Dory's story. And that's the beauty also of stories, right? Is that everybody's experiences are different, but there will be points of resonance that connect to our own stories. And so I invite you all to kind of drink deeply as we listen to this together, and listen for points of resonance for yourself, and any feelings that this might arise. This is also coming from the experience of COVID, right? And this is something we've all walked, but we've all walked it a little bit differently. So here, listen for the spirituality, listen for and just also the points of resonance, right? But listen deeply, and as you do, then we will break out into groups, and as Dory was explaining, take opportunity to listen to each other's stories and points of resonance with the same idea of what have you used to ground yourself or sustain yourself recently, whether COVID or even before that. So here I'm reading from Dory's most recent article that was in the most recent RE. I ask for your patience. I am only just learning how to walk with my ancestors. Most mornings, shortly after I awaken, I open a door beside my bed and move barefoot into the dewy grass. Coffee in hand, I step into a ritual that grounds me to a collective energy, something bigger, older, wiser, and stronger than me. I face east, pour a sip of black coffee to the soil, then inhale deeply, enjoying the steamy aroma before taking a long, slow sip. Wise and loving ancestors in front of me, I pray, bringing to mind my elderly mother and father, who live 100 yards in that direction as the crow flies. I give thanks for each of them and for their parents' parents before them, imagining a spiral of loving energy circling out and above their big magnolia tree, whose very tip I can see from where I stand. Wise and loving ancestors behind me, I pray, visualizing my young adult daughters, both of whom live 3 time zones away. I give thanks for each of them, still asleep in their beds at this hour. I conjure a blessing to enfold them for today. It flows through my maternal and paternal lineages, fanning out to support me, my children, and all those whom they will touch and be touched by today. I work my way through this adaptation of a prayer attributed to St. Patrick. Instead of addressing Christ in all directions as St. Patrick did, I appeal to my wise and loving ancestors, an inclusive gathering that opens to an ever-widening cloud of relatedness. Instead of asking for protection, as St. Patrick's prayer seems to do, I seek connection, focus my respect, and express a desire for direction. I acknowledge the ancestors of my blood lineage, as well as the ancestors of the land on which I stand. At points in the prayer, I give thanks and ask a blessing on my neighbors in the Monacan region, whose community is centered just across the James River. As I face the heart of my city, which was home to an active slave trade in the 19th century, I honor the stories of those who crossed the Atlantic by force. I remember children who are living in poverty, the women who stayed last night in the domestic violence center, and the old city cemetery, a final resting place of our Black institution builders. I look up and see the birds. I look down and remember the earthworms. My prayer daily reweaves a web of relatedness that honors the maybes, what-ifs, and possibilities of human relationships and evolution that exceed my knowledge. This ritual may seem threadbare if you come from a lineage that mindfully passed down traditions of tending well to ancestral ways. If your heritage has intact practices that fuel connection with those who came before you, mine may seem simplistic, maybe even wannabe. I ask for your patience. I am only just learning how to walk with my ancestors. I think we'll stop there with the reading and move now to groups. And as Dory
Josh,
shared,
let me just thank you for that, Josh. Thank you for that slow reading. I appreciate that, and I want to just say what I hope that helped y'all imagine my practice, and I want to free you to imagine your practice, whether it's something that came to you new or whether it's something you've always held. But as you have one full moment before we even put you in your breakout rooms, just think about the story you want to tell about what practice grounded and centered you during COVID and or during the last 2 years, during the last this era we've been living in. But I just want to say that's not quite fair because you're just going to have 2 minutes. And I think my story was longer than that. so I got to be the thoughtful, I got to do everything you're not going to have a chance to do in terms of thinking about how the story will be told. So you get to do what does our friend Renee call she calls it the shitty first draft. So this will just be off the cuff and it'll be way less polished, but I appreciate Josh sharing that with you all. So let's just take a moment now as he's doing the magic behind the scenes to split us up, to just be quiet and think of what story wants to be told. want you to just begin wondering what you heard yourself saying that maybe surprised you, or maybe there's a practice that surfaced that you didn't realize was very important to you. And we're really curious about surfacing some of those in this conversation.
Okay, we've got everybody back now.
Yay, hi friends.
Right, actually, I'm going to turn the, yeah, okay, there's no screen share. So we'll take a moment if people want to share a little bit about what they heard in their groups. So maybe some of the practices that emerged, and it could be your own, or it could be one that you heard when you were listening. What has sustained you? What has grounded you in this time? It might be something similar to what Dory expressed. It might be a traditional practice that comes from your tradition. It could be something else entirely. It could be something that isn't necessarily considered spiritual. So at least in what we would normally think. So feel free to think broadly about this. But I think we'd love to hear what people have to share, what wisdom we have.
I can go first if you don't mind. So my name is Paulette Isaac Savage. I'm a professor of adult education at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So in my group, one of the members, Alan, shared with us how technology actually helped him during the pandemic. A lot of times we think about technology kind of getting in the way, but for him, it really helped him to kind of slow down and think a lot because he got involved with video games. And so I just really found that surprising that, because when I think of video games, I think of distractions, but in his case, it really helped him during the pandemic. So that really stood out to me as something that someone shared in our group.
Wonderful. Other practices, things that have sustained us, or ground us.
I'd share an observation that all three of us had outdoors. It was outdoors that we found a lot of our grounding. Ocean, park, walk, etc.
In my group of two, there seemed to be a theme of reflection and in a midst of reorientation, disorientation, and orientation that were happening in multiple spheres. One of us went a little more specific in terms of practicing gratitude. And then the other one of us spoke about reading broadly in ways that both centered and decentered, sustained and grounded and shook the ground a little bit, but in ways that then allowed for reflection on the ongoing, orientation, disorientation that we have through a lifetime, and specifically a lifetime of faith formation and reformation.
And we're seeing notes in the chat about how important outdoors was, and yoga with Adrian, and embodiment in some form or fashion.
It's an interesting idea of using, finding YouTube and finding YouTubers or content creators as a way of connecting and finding connection. That's definitely not something that we were talking about 20, 30 years ago. but now is very much a part of people's lives. Maybe also thinking also about maybe the specific urgencies that we were just looking at and asking about, and how might our spiritual practices that we're thinking about, and we're you know, we might, I think we're going to jump into another spiritual practice here in a second. We can ask this question again, but how do these spiritual practices, or how do our spiritual practices in general address these urgencies that we've been looking at, whether it's climate control or dealing with the violence and the discriminatory practices that we see in our culture and see in our world? What do our spiritual practices have to say about this?
I think I can chime in. So as many of you heard me saying in different contexts, including the opening panel at APT, I curated a 2 art exhibit called Invisible, Hypervisible, to do public theological work outside of a church and Christian or seminary context, having experienced anti-Asian hate crimes myself, and feel like I am only speaking to the choir in progress with theological context, but the education needs to be outside of that circle. So collaborating with Asian American artists and doing public theology work through art really empowered. You know, I don't like this term empowered at all, but it really literally empowered me. And ABC News that did a story about that titled that changing trauma into power. So so that's you know, Josh, your question. That's how I have been dealing with, still dealing with, but also finding that medium of arts for public theological work, religious education work outside of my normal context, really gives me a lot of spiritual strength.
Thanks, Bill Young. I certainly resonate with that. Like spiritual teaching is a spiritual practice, within, whether it's within our classrooms or whether it's expanding our classrooms. We are teaching as a spiritual practice. That's beautiful. I think I'm ready to bring us back into another spiritual practice, if we feel that that's time for that, Josh, and that'll save us more time for reflection on our art and craft as scholars and practitioners around this in the end.
Absolutely. And Amy just mentioned art journaling, which is another great example. Yeah.
Wonderful. One of the things I've learned from Lisa Miller is the flashlight effect, and that spiritual practices are beneficial in the moment that we do them. Like journaling as a spiritual practice. I used to think before COVID, actually, I thought of journaling. I thought I was journaling so I could remember and come back to it, so that I could remember and come back on these wonderful insights I was having. But somewhere along the way, I learned that journaling is effective in the moment that you do it. The practice itself is enough. Just that practice itself is grounding and centering for me, whether I come back to that piece of art or that doodling or that prose later. The flashlight effect is the way in which, when we know we have a spiritual practice, it's even more effective for us. So knowing that journaling that I journaled yesterday and that was good for me might make it a little more inviting to get out of bed and journal the next morning, which means I had a reason to get out of bed. And I'm always reading this through the eyes of my young adult practitioners, my young adult collaborators who are struggling with, do I have a reason to get out of bed tomorrow, for all the reasons that we've named in those urgencies? Like, am I going to be able to make a difference around climate change? Is my path going to become clear in a way? Well, the first step of that is like getting out of bed, right? That's enough mental health. And then if we can do that and get through our day, maybe meaning and purpose, which is sort of a second layer or second level of healthiness, has a chance to arrive, has a chance to be discerned. So we're going to just do a practice now that invites our ancestors to the table, and we'll invite you to have a place to journal, whether that's your phone or a scrap of paper or your actual journal. Have it handy, and that way you can write down anything that you want to hold on to. The slide says naming our ancestors. I didn't get to change that. It's actually welcoming our ancestors. This is a guided meditation on welcoming our ancestors. And I'll say, you know, go only where your heart leads you, go only where you feel safe going in this meditation. Just, you know, take care of yourself as we do this about 10-minute practice. So again, try to get your gecko toes on the ground if that's comfortable for you. And I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and take 3 deep cleansing breaths. The deepest breaths you've given yourself all day. And I'm actually going to do this right now because I haven't given myself 3 good breaths yet today. So here we go. 3 deep cleansing breaths. Now I invite you to close your eyes if that's safe and welcoming to you. And I invite you to imagine before you a table, maybe the kitchen table where you grew up. It may be your grandma's kitchen table. Imagine before you a table. It might be a picnic table out in the woods. Invite to your table now the wise and loving ancestor or elder you conjured up in the very beginning of our gathering. This is a wise and loving ancestor who's been part of your unfolding. Just imagine that person making themselves comfortable with you at that table. So you're sitting face to face. You're allowing yourself to take in that person's face and the feelings that flood over you. And I want to invite you now to allow yourself to receive this person's best intentions for you. Receive their expression of love. Return to them an expression of love or gratitude. Now to this table, invite your eternal higher self, however you imagine that to be. Conjure up what they look like and invite them to sit with you and this wise elder at this table. Imagine them bringing their best intentions for you. Allow yourself to receive those intentions. Let them wash over you. And return to them your expression of love and gratitude. And now to this table, invite your higher power, whoever or whatever that is for you, whether you call it God, Allah, Jehovah, Jesus, Source, Creator, inner knowing. Invite that higher power, however it emerges in your imagination, to bring its best intentions for you to this table. And allow yourself to receive fully these good intentions. return to them expression of your love or gratitude. And now, with all of these beings sitting here around this lovely table that you've created, ask a simple question. What do I need to know right now? What do they want to tell me? What do I need to know right now? What do they need to tell me? I'm going to give you about another minute here to just linger in the presence of these beautiful beings. And now I'm going to ask you to, whenever you're ready, open your eyes and come back to this Zoom room and journal for a few minutes. If there was a knowing, an intuition, a voice, a word, a good word that came for you that you don't want to lose, you might want to journal that. And then I'm just going to ask you if anyone wants to share in the chat box what surfaced for them. Was there anything that came that was helpful in pausing in the middle of this day with this group of people to welcome some relationship with those wise and loving ancestors? And then Josh, I think you want to take them back into their triad, right? For conversation after let's just welcome a few things into the chat box. Thank you, Tiffany. Nice to see you, Tiffany. Basking in the presence of them. Gratitude. Feeling loved. Accepted, encouraged.
I think we can also acknowledge that there might be some words here that that are for you, and maybe not for all of us. There may be some words that this group is telling you that that you want to keep to yourself, and that's totally okay as well. That is, but it's also wonderful to share, and for us to glean from each other. So.
And also, Josh, I always like to say when I lead a guided meditation, sometimes nothing happens at all, and that's okay too. Sometimes it's just not our day. That's okay.
And that's also part of the practice, right? It's,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Perhaps we break out for a little bit. I think the idea is that, do you think we're okay to move on here, Dory?
I just want to say one thing, and then we will break into threes, and maybe you'll have the convening question in the chat box for when we break into those threes. I want to say in my own, not research, my own anecdotal conversations with young adults lately, when I've asked them the question I asked at the beginning, tell a story, tell me, what have you done for grounding and centering? A lot of time, or once recently, someone said to me, I binged Netflix. That's what I needed to do. And Josh reminded me of this when he said, yeah, of course, we don't always share and something always doesn't happen. And as I asked her about what that binging of Netflix looked like for her, she said, it was really about saying no. It was about saying no to all the people in my house, about all the other opportunities there were to do something, because what I needed to do was curl up on my bed and be alone, choose aloneness, choose some isolation, choose to have my mind be taken to a place that it wasn't. And I had a wonderful conversation with her about how is that a spiritual practice? And if it's almost a spiritual practice, what might you add to it that would make it a spiritual practice? Or if it's healing, just naming it as saying no, like binging Netflix is saying no. And that is a spiritual practice of discernment, right? So into your groups you go, and we're going to help turn the conversation from what was that practice like for you to how are you already engaging in practices in your teaching and learning with your students and with your future students. How are you already doing this, and what are some of the obstacles? So I know one of the obstacles for me is the way I use my God language. And, when I look over that meditation I just led, which was adapted from the work of Lisa Miller, I'm wondering, would it be offensive to someone? How do I bring my lens of cultural competency to it? How do I make sure that I'm holding a practice that's been borrowed from another tradition with as much care as I can muster, knowing that I probably might not get it right? How do I keep private the places that I'm pulling from a tradition, that's not ready to be public yet, that I don't have enough relationship with to be sharing? So all of those questions, I think, are issues for us as we lead. And then one other thing that I'm curious about is the tension between giving practices away and saying, go, you 24-year-old, you know how to lead this, lead it. You learned about it on YouTube, do it. The tension between that, because it may be of some good, it may be saving a life somewhere, right? But the tension between that, and we know a lot, those of us on this Zoom call, about how to hold spiritual practices with care. We've learned the hard way because we've messed it up, right? We've learned about cultural competency. Oh my gosh, our church traditions are learning about how to create safe spaces around gender dynamics, around caring for the whole embodied person. And so one of the things I told a young adult recently is like, go lead holy listening, but don't send people off in pairs, send them off in triads, because that adds another layer of protection in case you get stuck in a room with someone who doesn't feel safe, right? So there's these things we know that are practical and that are also like steeped in the wisdom of our traditions. And so how do we deal with that tension that could be an obstacle to us or could be an invitation? So those are two things I hope will surface in the rest of our conversation, either in the small groups or as we have a good bit of time when we come back together.
So I'll try to summarize that and put it in the chat, and then I'll send out a message. Tell me, Dory, if this captures it for you. This idea of reflecting on spiritual practices and expanding our definition as we do that. What are some tools, resources, and paradigm shifts that you're using or would like to use? What obstacles do you face? And this idea of also how do we hold each other with care as we do so and as we teach.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we will break out here.
And we're going to give like 5 minutes for this conversation.
Yeah,
Does that sound right?
5 minutes.
Okay.
Or so. Yeah.
Josh, can you put Greer and Zen, I can't remember her first name, in a different group? Greer technology was not working great, and I don't want, I can't remember her first name, Zen, to be all alone. She might be this number here. Are you able to assign her to a different? There she goes. And you might as well assign Greer someplace else too and see if she's able to connect. She told me she was having connectivity issues. I was in her small group. Greer, can you hear me, Greer?
That's so funny. I'm sitting here talking to you and I'm muted.
Oh, were you talking to me?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I know you got to tell me everything you said. I thought Josh just went right in. I thought you were in another group on your other device.
No, I thought I was. I the way it's set up, I actually didn't end up anywhere. So
okay, all right. Well, now fill me in. What about me?
No, I was kind of talking it through, and I thought it kind of seemed like you were. So Greer she's in room 4 now.
Okay, she was in my first breakout, and she was having technology issues.
Yeah, and
she did get to share, and then she said, she was great about saying I can share right now, and then she shared, and then
she's
it's
back.
just in and out. But she did get to share. I was so grateful.
That's good. I think I tried to move. Yeah, I'm trying to move Greer to room 3, and it didn't.
You know, I think you should pull him back so that you have. We were supposed to have a half an hour for that closing, and I want to make sure you have enough time to pull the threads through. So they'll be more talkative now after they've been together. That was a good move.
That's the idea. So but I also want to, this is the thing that people are going to really. Oh,
okay, great.
This.
Josh, you're muted.
Gosh, yeah, it's hard enough to keep the muting on track when you're using one device, let alone 2. So Dory and I were talking a little bit about how to best to since we only have 10 more minutes, but we wanted to give everybody a chance to interact and also to share. I maybe do a combination here. If you would like to share some tools and resources and paradigm shifts and some of the things that, or just ideas that you all discussed in the conversation that you had, feel free to put those in the chat. And then as you feel comfortable, for those of you that are a little more on the extroverted side and feel comfortable just kind of jumping in, go ahead and share out loud as well so that we can all hear. I'm going to go ahead and share one question from me that's kind of stewing around in my head, this idea of us being, I'm really intrigued by this idea, especially for those who think of us and ourselves as in academic terms or in administrative terms, which kind of encapsulates various sides of the different work that we do. We think of ourselves as spiritual practice leaders. Well, that may be a little bit odd for us if we're thinking about ourselves. You know, that's what ministers do, and many of us, of course, are in ministry as well. But the idea that spirituality and as facilitating and being shepherds and midwives of this of spiritual practices as being kind of central to what we do might actually seem a little bit dissonant for some of us. And I think that there's something really powerful about that idea as well. And it comes back to, it's a one way of accessing the same question that we started and that we used as a title for this whole thing, which is is this something the world needs right now? I think of the fact that, you know, spiritual practices are something that we have not, we think of the church in particular in the United States as declining. Religious communities are not what they were 20, 30 years ago, in many cases for the better. But we are also trying to understand what all that means for us. And, you know, maybe part of it also is understanding, and some of the Lisa Miller's research shows us that people aren't afraid of spirituality, that it's not actually we're not anti-spirituality, it's that there's baggage attached to forms of religion. And there's and that we can still, many of us still find a lot of life-giving elements in religious traditions, and many times we crave that connection to tradition as well. And there's something missing for people to feel that feeling, that ancestral connection to these practices. But what might it mean for us to be stewards and facilitators of these practices is reclaiming some of that, but also finding ways of being spiritual, or kind of taking what people are already doing that is inherently spiritual, because all of life is spiritual, and reframing that in a way for people. And as religious educators, as lifelong learning coaches and leaders and facilitators, how to help others lead other communities in that same practice. What might that look like, and how might that help us reframe even what we're doing? Because as Lisa Miller's research suggests, this is something the world does need. So that's something that I'm playing with and thinking about. But go ahead, and if you have things that from the conversation that you had that you want to share, do it in the chat or share it out loud as you were comfortable.
Also, I'll mention that I added the link to Lisa's book in the chat. And I have another question, which is just, I'm so curious, does this make anyone itch? Is there something bothering you about this conversation?
That's good.
Dory, can you say more what you mean by that?
I'm just wondering, you know, as presenters, we assume, right, that everyone is good with this. Like, yeah, we want to jump out there and do that. But is there a reason why not to? Is there a reason that this makes you uncomfortable? Is there a reason that you hold back from sharing spiritual practices in the classroom, in your family, in your, you know, wherever? Are there really good, you know, is there an edge there that's interesting to explore?
Yeah. Personally, I'm comfortable with the conversation about spirituality. As a priest, a Catholic priest, I have this idea about structure. Personal spirituality development is something we need to address today and take serious. Personal spiritual development, as spirituality is being redefined to incorporate religion, We have religious spiritualities and non-religious in terms of affiliation to religious traditions known. We may look at structures, basic things about definition of spirituality that is sort of universal. Like I see three major things. One is worldview, personal worldview, and then appropriated from the general one. And then in the formation of personal spirituality, to have sense of connectedness, and we have life meaning and purpose. So these three are very basic. The content may differ from religion to religion, but this definition of spirituality in this way as an educational domain could be a way to go. And talking about structures, as a priest, I live the structure of at least 4 prayer hours a day. But basically, at least I don't miss the morning and evening prayer. So these are sort of stable personal spiritual practice structure. Within these times, I could expand them to include meditations, mass, and other forms of spiritual practices. So I think that spirituality defined in terms of universal personal spiritual development, no matter what religion one is, like a personal religion is a way to go. And maintaining structure, personal spiritual practice structure that is stable. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm just reading Erica's, yeah.
Yes. It makes me think about being the host at a dinner party or a Priya Parker gathering. Priya Parker has a lot to say about this, to Erica's point and Gabriel's too. Like, how do we structure the time that we share these practices? How do we choose them with great intention and care so they're the right practice for the right people at the right time, knowing that we can't always get that exactly right? But how do we, you know, from my training as an ethnographer, how do we listen first? How do we deeply listen to the context so we know what practice might be helpful to a given community, whether they know their community yet or not? When we start to invite them into a practice, we're inviting them into a community.
Sierra Marie's thoughts there?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. You know, I think to your question, Dory, about does this resonate or where does this itch or where does it, I forget what you had said, like there's a little bit of tension there. No, I'll just situate myself. I'm in the Bay Area, teaching in a Bay Area school, and I came from the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, with 2 areas that are really becoming less and less in terms of organize or less and less participation in organized religion. Okay, and I know that there's different literature out there and research out there that, you know, contests that and so forth. But by and large, I think anecdotally, that's my experience has been that. Where I've found where some of my most life-giving conversations have been last 3 years, 4 years, has actually been, and this is part of my own just well-being and mental health, has been on the golf course, like just being active in nature and walking slowly while I'm doing this. But it's been amazing the types of connections I've made that I would not have been able to make in organized religious institution, you know?
Thank you.
With people that have no idea, no intention of stepping foot into an institutional religious space. And yet the types of conversations I've had with them have been around the elections and how can people commit to something that they see as very anti-gospel and then me having to be apologetic in terms of not apologizing, but saying there is a different narrative out there or narratives out there. For me to have conversation with the people around, what really gives you joy, like meaningful, purposeful conversations around existential life questions.
That's good.
And so the religious education question for me is not maybe how do we restructure the forms, but where do we restructure the space in which we do this spiritual formation in language where people will never use the language of spirituality, but they're the tension points of where they're trying to move towards is very much in my understanding of spirituality.
That's great.
Thank you. I appreciate you broadening the category. And it's like, can watching Netflix be a spiritual practice? Maybe that should have been our title. But yes, conversation on the golf course as a spiritual practice. It's about the intentionality we bring to it. We don't want it to disappear. Everything is not a spiritual practice, but how do we hold it? And what is the intentionality that we bring to it? And how do we bring our awareness? And I'm really going to appreciate the chat. If you haven't had a chance to read it, Sierra Maria has added some really important things about embodiment and also about trauma. And I do think that young people holding so much trauma does present an obstacle in our teaching, and we do become afraid of leading practices. They can seem so simple to us around breath or around embodiment, can seem so simple to those of us who don't have trauma around breathing, or don't have issues around ability. And so we want to bring all that, and yet we don't want to let that completely immobilize us from sharing practices when we can and when they're appropriate, because they might be life-saving. So, I'm learning how to do more trigger warnings, learning how to do trigger warnings more carefully, giving people an opportunity to stay with what they're comfortable with and check out for what's not. Thank you, Dean. And we are out of time. But thank you, Dean, for your chat about Nancy Ammerman. Y'all, it's been really fun to be here with you. I put my contact information in the chat box. I love to have feedback or more conversation.
Yeah, we didn't have time for our closing thing, but we had just a little passage here at the end. But it was just to say, I'll let Dory share if she wants to share here, but
Sure.
just to say that
We'll just end with this passage that was something that my ancestors really did gift me with during the last 2 years. We are all at crossroads, and we will be at crossroads again. The crossroads our institutions are facing, the crossroads in our own personal lives as we restructure, to quote you, Gabriel, structure our lives. So let's just end with this from Jeremiah 6:16. Stand at the crossroads and look, and ask for the ancient paths where the good way lies, and walk in it and find rest for your souls. So may that send us forth into the rest of this meeting. I have great gratitude for getting to share this space with you. Thank you.
There's just a few resources there for us. Thank you all. I know we went a little bit long here, but I hope that you all found opportunities here to connect and rejuvenate. It's also very good to see many familiar faces and new faces as well. Welcome to both REA and ALLLM. If you're curious about learning more about ALLLM, let us know. If you're involved with lifelong learning or just somebody who is interested in learning more about what ALLLM does, you don't have to be in a lifelong learning program in order to do that, but also learn more about the relationship that we have with REA. I hope that this has been helping us think about what it means for us to be spiritual and spiritual leaders, and be thinking about how those connections happen, and what that actually means for our own lives and for the people that we work with as ministry leaders, and for those who are leading communities. Be thinking about even just this idea of holy listening. I'm really thankful to Dory for this, in the sense that when we can listen to others well, it gives us the opportunity to now listen for the opportunity to ritualize, the opportunity to find the spirituality within where we are at, and maybe as educators, as in whatever context we might find ourselves, to help us do that well and to help others do that well, I think would be really beautiful. And yes, Sarah wanted to remind us also about that that ALLLM is doing some coaching cohorts for those who are involved with lifelong learning, specifically, or if you're just getting started in that world, but also have been in it for a while. We have 2 different cohorts available. If you have some goals, or you have some things that you want to work through, or just want to be part of a community of others who are doing lifelong learning, this cohort program is made possible by grants. Sarah, you can correct me. I think it's the Thriving in Ministry Initiative. Is it the Duke Leadership?
Yes, the Strengthening Ministry Initiative. So thank you.
Yeah, so that's an incredible opportunity that, and please feel free to take advantage of that. Again, a big thank you to Dory for being with us today. We're very grateful for you and for your wisdom and for your heart and compassion, and as you've led us today.
Thank you.
Go with God and continue to take this spirit of listening, holy listening, into the rest of the REA discussion. And we're looking forward to seeing everybody in the other sessions.